the hymn Amazing Grace is powerful. Just wait till you hear this story behind it. Let's talk about it with Bruce Hindsmarsh on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And we're so glad you're here. You always have a seat at our table. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter, who's our executive producer, is here. Matthew loves food, but there's some things he simply can't eat. Just one donut. Or one potato chip.
Constitutionally incapable.
Our producer, Jinx, is in his little glass booth. Speaking of food, what's in your lunchbox today?
Today, we have shrimp scampi.
Ooh.
Straight from the fridge.
I'm already hungry. And then our one-man IT department, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. John's favorite hymn is Morning Has Broken. Now I have to fix that too.
That's a good one, Matthew.
Yeah, you can say that one.
Thank you.
And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George is glad we can still call them hymns instead of thems.
Oh, gosh.
And Kathy Wyatt, get ready for this. Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Her favorite hymn is about cakes. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free.
Sweet, sweet melody.
Listen, I just
Matthew.
read this. I don't write them.
Good night, everybody.
We have a great program today, and I've been looking forward to this. Bruce Hindsmarsh is the James M. Houston Professor of Spiritual Theology and Professor of the History of Christianity at Regent College in Vancouver. He speaks and writes regularly on history, theology, and spiritual life, and his latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is Amazing Grace, the life of John Newton and the surprising story behind his song. Bruce, thanks so much for taking time out of a busy schedule to be with us. And
Good to be with you today, Steve.
And listen, thanks for writing this book, too. You know, there's a quote from John Newton, and I don't know whether he really said it or not, but it is a powerful quote, and if he didn't say it, in heaven, he wishes he did. I was a wild thing on the coast of Africa, and Jesus caught me and tamed me, and now people come to look at me as they watch the animals in the zoo. Whether he said it or not, that's a true statement, isn't it? I guess that most people know the name John Newton, but don't know much about him. So you got to introduce us to your friend before we go any further.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to do that. I got to know John Newton probably 30 years ago working on my doctorate at Oxford, and I came across John Newton. And my children would say that for a living, their dad reads dead people's mail. So I was reading his mail, and there's hundreds and thousands of letters. He was a great letter writer. He kept big, massive diaries, and but I returned. So that was 30 years ago, and I returned to the research and to look at John Newton because it is the 250-year anniversary of his hymn, Amazing Grace. And so there was an occasion here to tell the story behind the hymn, because most people, I can't think of anybody that wouldn't know the song Amazing Grace. It's become so popular, and it's gone so deep in our consciousness, even in times of tragedy. But a lot of people don't know the story behind the song. And he wrote it as a clergyman, a pastor in the English Midlands, about age 39. And it's a quiet English town, a market town, perhaps 2,000 people. And he wrote it on New Year's Day and invited his people to look back because it's the passing of the year, and then to look forward, how grace has brought us safe thus far and grace will lead me home. But the quietness, the pastoral setting for that introduction of the hymn, what a contrast when you think of his previous life. Because he, if anybody had been through many dangerous toils and snares, it was John Newton. And you've alluded to that, Steve, by talking about this episode, one of the very low points in his life, when in his 20s, he should have died many times, many near-death experiences, but he was abused. He was far from home. He was in chains. He was malarial. And he was some of the time starving, sort of eating, roots and whatever things he could find. It was a low point in his life. And part of the story we tell is how he got there and how he recovered from that. And the drama in his story, my co-author, Craig Borlase, who wrote this book with me, he talks about so much of his story is kind of made for television. There's just a reckless love in his youth, death, loss, and trauma, and kidnapping as he's impressed into the Navy at age 18, and so on. So many dramatic things happened to him. Some very sort of difficult and tragic things happened to him. But then also there was a kind of descent as he walked away from his childhood faith. His mother had taught him the hymns of Isaac Watts, and at her knee that he kind of learned these hymns. And by the way, it's interesting hearing you joke around at the beginning about some of these hymns, because when Isaac Watts introduced these, there are some people who thought we should still only sing psalms. We shouldn't sing these hymns. And they called them Watts's whims instead of Watts's hymns. And
Wow.
but he grew up in this, his mother went to a dissenting chapel in East London, and he learned the hymns of Isaac Watts. She was hoping someday he would be a minister. But then just before his 7th birthday, she died, probably tuberculosis, and he was left all alone in the world. His father was a captain in the Merchant Marine. His father was away on a voyage. And you have to picture this young boy, 6 years old, kind of all alone in the world. And when his father returned, he remarried in some haste, and the new step family, he really didn't fit in. And he kind of felt even alone within that family. And he said his phrase was, he overawed my spirit. He was kind of afraid of his father, called him sir. And so into his teen years, he kind of walked away from his faith. His heart became hard. He became what in 250 years ago, they would call it a free thinker, or we might say an agnostic, and a libertine, they called it, living without moral restraint. And he kind of begins this long walk away from God. 18 years of age, he'd been on a few voyages with his father, being kind of apprenticed to the Merchant Marine. And he's walking around near the River Thames in his checked sailor shirt. And he's incautious. He said as a teenager, his motto was never deliberate. We can think of some teenagers like that haven't grown a prefrontal cortex yet and aren't really, very cautious. And at 18 years of age, he's walking by the River Thames. Why is it so incautious to do so? Britain is about to go to war with France, and legally, the Navy can kidnap people and impress them into the Navy, and that's what happened to him. He was caught. He didn't have proper papers, and he finds himself in the brutal life before the mast, living the life of a common sailor. at 18 years of age. And he had earlier fallen recklessly in love, and this is devastating to him. He thought they're going to be gone for 5 years, and he would never see the love of his life, Mary Catlett, again. And so before the ship could leave the south coast of England, he went AWOL, and he left the ship, and he's captured, brought back in chains, and then he is whipped with a cat of nine tails. And as the ship is leaving the coast of England, he had dark thoughts of murder, suicide. Perhaps he would murder the captain and kill himself. So desperate was he, and that began his descent into the darker world of the Navy and ultimately the slave trade.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Listen, guys, if you think you're bad, you don't know nothing. I mean, and if God could do for John Newton what he did for him, he could probably do something for you. You got to get this book. It can be read devotionally and historically, can be studied by a small group, and it's a great book. Amazing Grace, the life of John Newton, and the surprising story behind his song. We're going to see when we come back if John Newton had any idea when he wrote this hymn that God was going to use it the way he did. Don't go anywhere. Hey, thanks for joining us. We're hanging out with Bruce Hindsmarsh. His latest book is called Amazing Grace, the life of John Newton and the surprising story behind his song. An amazing song. Bruce, when we hit the break, John was in the mud. I mean, there wasn't a lot of hope. He had murder on his mind and suicide on his mind. He was in love, and the love had been cut off. He was co-opted into a job he didn't want, where he could possibly die. He had no hope and nothing. So he died, right?
Yes, that would be a short story. I mean, the counterfactual history, there'd be no Amazing Grace. We need to get to the grace part of this story. We left him in his 20s, and he ends up exchanged out of the Navy onto a merchant ship in West Africa, and then he ends up on shore, and he was apprenticed to what they called a slave factor. It's like a wholesale or a kind of trading post for slaves on shore, and that's where he found that he was himself enslaved. He was mistrusted by his master and his master's black mistress, who kind of ran this trading post, and that's the low point that we referred to, where he ended up in chains himself, and quite a desperate situation where he should have died. He's in his 20s. Eventually, he's able to be released from that predicament, and his father had people looking out for him. And there's a ship called the Greyhound that in 1747 comes calling and says, "Is there a John Newton around here on the west coast of Africa?" And they find John Newton, and they get him on board the ship. And this is not a slave ship. This is a merchant ship, and it's making a long trip down the coast of West Africa into equatorial waters, and then a huge arcing voyage up past the coast of Brazil, past the West Indies, past Newfoundland, and making its way across the North Atlantic in 1748. And 275 years ago, we're recording this on March 21st. 275 years ago, on March 21st, in the middle of the North Atlantic, there is a huge storm. Newton is awakened in the middle of the night. and finds that the ship is foundering in this storm. The waves are mountains high. They're crashing across and covering the deck. A man goes up before him, up the ladder onto the deck, and he is swept overboard and lost. And in the midst of this storm, he is tied to the pumps. He is tied to the ship while piloting the ship in the night. And he just kind of mutters to himself, if this will not do, if we're not going to survive, then the Lord have mercy. And then he realized, and you can feel the tension. He goes, but how could there be mercy for somebody like me? And it's like all the agonies of his repressed conscience. It's like a crack opens, and all of a sudden, his conscience is awake again, and he realizes, what if this is true? What if there is a God? Could there be mercy for me? And do you know, Steve, for the rest of his life, in those diaries that I read 30 years ago, on the anniversary of this, every March 21st, he would stop and he would remember this was kind of a beginning. This was the beginning of God's new work in his life. And he wouldn't call it his conversion. He would say there was a kind of slow dawning of the light, but this is where he began to be serious and realize perhaps there is a God. Perhaps I need to be open again. And what do I do about how I have lived my blasphemous and adulterous past and the hardened life I have lived. And he begins asking questions and he said, by the time the ship survived and arrived in Ireland, I was no longer an infidel, was the word from that period. It's like, I believe there is a God. But, like maybe for many of us or some of your listeners, you think, okay, maybe it's time to be serious. I should try harder. And so he thought he should try harder, be an observant Christian, be an obedient Christian. But within 6 months on another ship, 6 months later, actually back on the west coast of Africa, he said, I returned like a dog to its vomit. And he was malarial again, and he crawled to an isolated spot on a West African island. And he said, you know what, this time I need to make an entire surrender. I need God to do for me what I cannot do for myself. And he said he turned to Christ on the cross, and he said, this time I'm letting go and trusting you completely. Almost like the alcoholic who has to reach bottom and let go. And he really thought that was the moment when his conscience was relieved and actually his health recovered. And he would see that as the real kind of beginning of grace doing a new kind of work in his life. But perhaps the hardest part of the book for the reader and for us writing it, and we want the reader to feel this tension, is for the next few years, Newton is still involved in the slave trade. He is taking his first steps to follow Christ. He's beginning to correspond with his childhood pastor, but he is still in the slave trade. And he makes several voyages as the captain of a slave ship before in 1754 he finally leaves the slave trade. There's signs he was beginning to be uncomfortable with this lifestyle, and he leaves the slave trade and he begins to study. He begins to wonder, is there an opportunity for me to tell other people about how gracious God has been to me? Perhaps if I tell them my story. He wants to be a part of the growing revival movement that's going on in England. And it's a long journey. It takes about 10 years, but eventually he is ordained to this small market town in Olney, where he will be a pastor in the Church of England, and where he will write hymns to go along with his sermons. They see a kind of an awakening, a kind of revival in the area, and it's there in 1772, at the end of the year, that he's thinking about what should I preach on tomorrow on New Year's Day. And he chooses a text that I can tell you more about in a little bit. It's he chooses a text from 1 Chronicles 17, 16, and 17, where King David is actually the one who in the first instance says, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. King David had a murderous and a blasphemous and a adulterous past, and yet he found grace and mercy. And that's the text to which Amazing Grace is written.
Oh, man. Good. Well, I got 1,000 questions. Trouble is, this clock keeps smacking me upside the head. And we all have questions, and we'll be asking them on the other side of the break. The name of the book is Amazing Grace, The Life of John Newton, and the surprising story behind his song. It's a great book, and it's moving, and it's existential. You'll find that you will use it for your devotions, and then you can become a spiritual giant like me. Don't go away.
Amazing.
Like Jesus, we're coming back. We're hanging out with Bruce Hindsmarsh, and you can keep up with him at brucehindmarsh.com. And that's Bruce spelled as you would expect Bruce to be spelled, and Hindmarsh the way it sounds, HINDMARSH.com.
Awesome. Bruce, before the break, you had brought us up to where he's now a pastor, and we've arrived at the occasion of him writing the hymn, and you alluded to the Old Testament scripture that kind of inspired it. I wonder if you'd pick it up from there, but also touch on, I'm curious to know, he's writing all these songs. Did he show any kind of creative bent before his conversion? Or did he go, I've got a lot of time on my hands, not drinking and cussing as much. I should pick up hymn writing.
That's right.
Where did this come from?
Yeah, there are, he would talk about making up songs on board ship to kind of mock the captain behind his back and that sort of thing. So we can imagine him singing sea shanties.
Yes. Okay.
And that sort of thing. There was a fiddler on board one of the ships. We know that they. So he had some kind of musical awareness and background, and he became quite a versifier. Like he could write letters in verse with his friend William Cooper, and but really, I think he, a lot of people wrote hymns in this period, but he wrote hymns because a lot of the people in the parish where he was ministering were poor, were illiterate, a large number, very, very few that would have been even middle class. And the hymns were a way to kind of, alongside the Bible teaching, to be able to help people remember the teaching, remember the passage, remember what he was doing. And then these kind of got grouped together and published as a little hymnal later. So this was a classic example of what he did every week. He sort of writes a sermon. In this case, it's about King David. We have the sermon that he wrote about King David, and how the prophet comes to David and prophet Nathan and says David had wanted to build a house for God, a temple, and Nathan says, nope, you're not going to build God's house. He's going to build your house. He's going to build your dynasty, and through your descendants will come the grace of God, of course, ultimately in Jesus Christ. And David stops and says, who am I? That you have spoken of the past of your servant and of the future. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And so there's all these wonderful layers that we can sort of see John Newton's story in this hymn. We can see King David's story, and we can see all of us, we can see our story in this song and in this story. And really, when Craig and I wrote this book, why would we write this book? It's the anniversary. What we're hoping is it's a kind of parable that we can see our lives in John Newton's life. We can think, when he makes very poor decisions. We can remember times in our life when we made poor decisions, when it seems like it takes him a long time for the grace of God to really work in his life and really change him. We realize it can take a long time for us. There were terrible things that happened to him for which he needed grace and mercy and kindness. And then there were things that he did himself that he would have to reckon with. There's signs, even quite early, that he had developed some anti-slavery sentiment. But it's really when he moved to London and became a pastor of a city church in London, and there was a kind of a kind of tidal change in public opinion that turned against the slave trade, and he became a part of that. One of the great things to see is as he got older, he really began to reckon with um, the iniquity of the slave trade, of what he had been involved in. And it's like when you can see the truth, instead of just running away, he walked right into it. He encouraged William Wilberforce in his campaign.
Mm.
He gave evidence to the Privy Council. He gave evidence to the House Select Committee. He wrote he tried to demolish the system that he had been a part of. And yet, there was contrition. He wrote to a member of the committee on abolition. He said, I hope God has forgiven me, but I ought to walk softly all my days in the remembrance of what I have been and what I have done.
Oh.
And as we get older, you can't get older without having a lot of regrets, the things you wish you had done differently. That's actually quite tender to see him beginning to reckon with that, doing what he can, but then walking with a kind of humility, knowing how much he had been forgiven, And in fact, one of the last things he said at 82 years of age, the last thing people remembered him saying, he said, my memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things, that I am a great sinner and that Christ is a great savior.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Before his death, Wilberforce was successful, right? I mean,
That's
he
right.
saw the fruit of those labors.
That's right. It was in the springtime that the abolition bill passed, and in the winter that then John Newton died.
Man. Guys, so much more to come, and you don't want to miss it. If you're not familiar with John Newton, you ought to be. Powerful voice for God's grace. And sometimes you have to go to the depths, the darkness, the pathos, before you can see it. So maybe you're there now. If you are, it's not an accident that you're watching or listening to Steve Brown, etc. We're going to take a break because this is hard work. Take a nap, have some cookies and milk. And then, like Jesus, we're going to return. Hey, we're hanging out with Bruce Hindsmarsh and his book, Amazing Grace, The Life of John Newton, and the surprising story behind his song.
Bruce, and we were kind of talking about it off air, but it's not just a history book. I mean, it's not just a biography. It seems to be written with maybe a couple of additional dimensions. I mean, it's a great just sort of narrative story. I mean, even, cliffhanging kinds of things that you've written into it in the style that you've approached. So it's very readable and enjoyable from that standpoint. But also and I'll make it kind of a two-part thing and then let you go with it, but also a very inspirational and encouraging type of story, almost a devotional type of approach. You bring those dimensions in as well. Can you kind of talk about those two aspects?
I'm glad that that's the way that you've perceived the book, because that's very much the way we tried to write it. My co-author, Craig Borlase, is a wonderful writer and a wordsmith, and he flew over from England. He lives south of Oxford, and during COVID. He's in our home for a couple different weekends, and we're storyboarding this book and thinking it through. And I'm the kind of historian that can't write, more than a sentence or two without a footnote. And he writes New York Times bestsellers, and he's never written a dull sentence in his life. And we kind of came together to try to say, can we tell this story for another generation? There's so much drama in the story itself, but not in a way that is sort of where you're sort of sitting back or looking down from 36,000 feet to narrate the story, but where it's more like live theater or like being in a film, to give the reader to immerse them, to show, not tell. And so we tried to write it in that kind of style, like a novel, that you can just be gripped by the narrative and carry it along. And Craig has a really good feel for that and telling the story. But then also we did want, like you say, that we want the reader to be able to see that this is a kind of parable. I see myself in this story. I see the hope that perhaps I can be forgiven for the things that I'm deeply ashamed of. We recognize, oh my goodness, if he could be deceived and self-deceived for a while about the slave trade, and it took him time to be undeceived, what is there in my own life? He said, custom, example, and interest had blinded my eyes. Custom, it's just everybody accepts it. Example, everybody's doing it. Interest, it's in my financial or other kind of self-interest to see things this way. He's saying once custom, example, and interest are operating, it's terrifying to think how blind we actually can be, good people can be. And so to see that operating in his story, we wanted the reader to go, okay, I can be forgiven, but I can also be deceived. And what is it in my life that I'm not seeing? And then, but also we wanted the reader to be able to see I can make amends. Even late in life, when I really begin to reckon with and to see that I can make a full confession, and I can do what I can to right the wrongs that I've been a part of, and I can try to make a difference, which Newton certainly did in his efforts with abolition. But then, the note we try to end on is I think Newton genuinely became a transformed man. He was a wise spiritual counselor. He was a powerful preacher. He was a courageous abolitionist, but he also became a gentle, I think, Christ-like person in his character. There was a real humility at the end. He didn't think, I'm John Newton. It's not amazing John Newton, it's amazing grace, that the story is about. And we want people to feel that grace can operate over the lifespan, not just conversion, one and done, and that's that. But actually, the closer we get to the light, the more impurities show up. The closer we get to the burning radiance of Jesus Christ and see him in his beauty and his glory, the more we say, woe is me, I am undone, depart from me, for I am a sinful man. As we move toward Jesus, we just let him expose all of that. And I think that's what happened in Newton's life as he walked toward Jesus.
So good.
Bruce, I have a quick question about the excuse me, about the hymn itself. A number of years ago, it has been a number of years ago now, one of the contemporary Christian artists did an updated arrangement of Amazing Grace, and they would sing some of the stanzas, and then it would follow with "My chains are gone, I've been set free." And it was a great song. And anyway, as it made it, when we first began to sing it, there was this stanza that I had never heard before. The earth will soon dissolve like snow, the sun forbear to shine, but God who calls me here below will be forever mine. And last Sunday at my new church, we sang Amazing Grace, and we sang a stanza that I have never heard before, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am, and I grew up in the church. Do you have any idea how many stanzas there were originally to this hymn, or did people come along at some point afterwards and add to it, or
That's
what?
kind of a fun story, Kathy, because the original hymn had 6 stanzas.
Okay.
And the hinge was, grace has led me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And the last 3 stanzas look forward through the balance of this life,
Yeah.
through death, to the end of all things, the earth shall soon dissolve like snow. That verse you just talked about
Right.
was the original last verse.
Is
In
that right?
1910, there was a almost vaudeville like, if that's the right word, sort of song leader, Edwin Othello Excel. What a dramatic name. And he found a verse in a hymn called Jerusalem, Our Happy Home, that had 70 verses. 70 verses. And I think he thought, if I steal one, nobody will notice. And he took the verse, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining. He stole it from Jerusalem, Our Happy Home, and he
Oh, you're
tagged it
kidding.
onto Amazing Grace and made it dropped the last 3 verses and made this the 4th verse, and it stuck.
Oh
And
my
it
goodness.
stuck.
Wow.
Wow.
How about that?
How about
Yeah.
that?
Wow. That's amazing.
Amazing.
I hope somebody asks me about that on a contest.
Yeah,
someday.
there you
You might
go.
win a bar bet.
And I win a lot of money. I'll give some of it to Key Life. I just want you to know. Grace, Bruce, I don't know where this hour's gone. It's been an absolutely fun hour. And we appreciate very much your writing this book with your co-author, and also you're spending your time with us.
Mm-hmm.
You keep writing. We're going to be talking every time you publish a book, and we'll look forward to that time.
Thank you. It's been good to be with you and chat on the 275th anniversary of that great storm.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Guys, the book is Amazing Grace, the life of John Newton and the surprising story behind his song. There's a supernatural flavor about this. And given that the final verse was stolen, it lends new meaning to Amazing Grace. Guys, we're gonna back out, but we're gonna come back for just a little bit and tell you who's gonna be our guest next week. And as always, you're gonna be blown away. You're gonna be amazed, and you're gonna be pleased. Hey, by the way, did you know that you can send us a prayer request directly through our Key Life app?
That's
You
pretty
don't
cool.
have the Key Life app? Where have you been living? That is such a cool app. I can't tell you. You can get it at any of the places where you get your apps. Not only that, it puts all of our radio shows, podcasts, videos, articles right on your phone. Give it a try at keylife.org/app. I'll tell you, we were just off the air talking about Bruce and what a delight he is and how Canadian he is. If he had ended up, with tattoos in funny places and, all of that, it would have just killed us. But love the book that he and his co-author wrote. Sometimes Amazing Grace has been used in powerful ways to draw people to Jesus for the initial conversion experience, the born-again experience. But as you know, the ministry of Key Life is not so much an evangelistic ministry as it is a ministry to God's people. We have this idea that once you come to Jesus, you're fixed. Once you come to Jesus, everything's fine, and you join hands and walk through the garden with him. That's just not true. If I had been there when the prodigal came back home and the fatted calf had been slain and the party had been had and the music and the wine, I would have said to him, "You're going to go back." And he would say, "No, I'm not going to do that. After this, how could I do that?" And I said, "Trust the old guy. You're going to go back, and you're not going to stay as long as you did before." and you're probably not going to screw it up as badly as you did before, but you're going back. Once the sun gets hot and the field work gets hard, you're going to go back. But just remember that God's grace is just as available when you know Him as it was when you didn't. Well, Catherine, who's going to be on next week?
Next week, we are rounding the corner on the on the Ortland men. Our friend Gavin Ortland, who has not been on our program before. His dad has, and his brother have also. But his book is Humility and How I Attained It. No, I'm just kidding. Humility, the joy of self-forgetfulness. What a great time we had with him.
Listen, Matthew, you're going to have to do this. I don't need this.
All right, I'm in.
Y'all, we're going to come back next week, same time, same place. Hope you'll join us. And between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide berth.
See what I started?
I know, it's your fault.